May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. They all ate and were satisfied, and they took up what was left over, 12 baskets full. A crowd of 5,000 people, not even counting the women and the children. The session goes late, and people are getting hungry, and the disciples say, send them to wait, because they need to get something to eat. And then Jesus, in a wonderful example of delegation of responsibilities, says, you give them something to eat. 5,000 people, women and children. You give them something to eat. One can imagine this moment, several moments of silence and awkwardness, while everybody tries to figure out how to provide a buffet lunch for 5,000 people plus men and women. But there's a kid in the crowd, and he has a limited amount of bread and limited amount of fish, and they begin distributing the food, and suddenly there's more and more, and it turns out not only is there barely enough, there's a wild abundance of food, and everybody is satisfied. This is the famous story, one of the most famous stories in the Bible, of the feeding of the 5,000. But it reminds one also of a story which occurs at the end of the life of Jesus in one of his post-resurrection appearances, a story which also illustrates that when Jesus is around, there's more than enough. There is always abundance for everyone when Jesus is around. The story I refer to at the end of the Gospels is the story of Jesus appearing to his disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. They've been fishing all night. They have caught nothing. They are experiencing scarcity. They're discouraged. They're tired. And Jesus encourages them to go back out again. Go into the sea, because there's probably more fish to be had. Peter says, Master, we've tried. There's nothing there. I guarantee it. Jesus says, go and try anyway. And all of a sudden, the nets are getting heavy because they're filled with fish. And the disciples are so amazed. This may be a record catch of fish. So they decide to actually count the number of fishes. And it turns out there are 153 fish in the boat. Again, when Jesus is around, there's more than enough for everyone. I don't know if you've experienced this. I suspect you have. Some time when you felt that God's presence was there in a very special way. It could have been at a time in nature when you felt God's presence in the natural world. It could have been at some religious conference when the Spirit was active. But somehow at that moment, and I think all of us have had such a moment if we think about it, at such a moment you feel that God is absolutely there. God is absolutely present in that place. Jesus is there. And at that moment, I'm sure you felt a sense of abundance. There was nothing that you didn't need. When people hang out with Jesus, there's more than enough. But I'd like to focus this morning in a passage which highlights another aspect of bread. Because it turns out there's bread and there's bread. This is a passage from the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah asks the people an interesting question. He says this, Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? All of us have had the experience of going through a period in our life when something is missing. There's no substance. There's no living bread. And that's what Isaiah is talking about. There's bread and there's bread. If you were a child growing up in the 1950s, as I was, you undoubtedly experienced Wonder Bread. Your mother probably made sandwiches of bologna and Wonder Bread, or peanut butter and Wonder Bread, or maybe ham and cheese in Wonder Bread. And you took those sandwiches to school with you in your Howdy Doody lunchbox, or your, I don't know what some of the others were, maybe your Hopalong Cassidy lunchbox, and there inside was your Wonder Bread sandwich with that Wonder Bread. Wonder Bread was made in 1921 by the Taggart Baking Company of Indianapolis. And Wonder Bread was one of the first breads to come pre-sliced, from where we get the saying, greatest thing since sliced bread. That was Wonder Bread. Wonder Bread made wonderful toast. It made very crisp and wonderful toast. But there was very little substance to Wonder Bread. Wonder Bread was the whitest of all white breads. Even though a popular TV program of the time, Howdy Doody, with its host Buffalo Bob, assured parents that Wonder Bread built 12 strong bodies 12 ways, there was very little substance to Wonder Bread. You could take a package of Wonder Bread and compress it to about the size of one slice of bread. Wonder Bread had very little there. There was not much substance to Wonder Bread. Now, in contrast to that, I have here real bread. This is real bread. This has some substance to it. This has some heft to it. This is chewy. This is delicious. You chew into this and you know you're actually eating something. It is an example of real bread. And that's the kind of spiritual sustenance we need. We need real sustenance. We need something with some heft to it, something that feeds us, something that leaves us satisfied. Real spiritual bread. Where do you find that for yourself? That's a question only you can answer. Where have you found that real spiritual bread, that sustenance in the past? I hope very much that you find it in the services that we do on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. I hope that provides for you real bread. But maybe you also find it in God's book of nature. Maybe you find that substance in quiet times when you're able to step away from the tumult of your life and just experience the silence and God's still small voice. Maybe you find that sustenance in service to others. Maybe that's what gives you a real sense of God's presence. What we want spiritually is not Wonder Bread. We want bread with heft and sustenance that leaves us satisfied. There's a fascinating story in the beginning of the Gospels in which the disciples, James and John, are standing and looking at Jesus from a distance. At this point, they're disciples not of Jesus, but John the Baptist. But I think they've heard of Jesus, they've probably heard him speak, they've heard him preach. They're curious, they're intrigued, and they're simply standing there looking at Jesus, and Jesus becomes aware of this. Jesus turns to them and says, "What are you seeking? What are you seeking?" This is always God's question to us. What are you seeking? What's missing from your life? What do you lack? What are you looking for that if you had it, your life would feel rich and powerful and fulfilled? What are you seeking? James and John don't have a clue how to answer that question, as you and I probably often don't know what we really are looking for. James and John are silent, but then they say, "Master, where are you staying? Where are you staying?" And Jesus says, "Come and see." That's what God always says to us. We can find Jesus if we look for him. Come and see where Christ is for you. Come and see. Jesus is waiting for you in that special place, offering the real bread of life.